Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're looking into a case that's it's really perplexing, the story of Juan David Ortiz. So, at first glance you might think, "Oh, this is just a regular guy,
Hmm.
family man, Navy vet, even a border patrol agent." But there's a twist, a seemingly normal life. Well, it masked a horrifying truth. Juan David Ortiz is a convicted serial killer who targeted sex workers in Texas. So today, we're going to try to unpack this whole thing. We'll dissect the case, try to understand what happened, and we're going to try to grasp the complexities of this without, sensationalizing the crimes themselves.
Right, and I think what really grabs you right away with this case is the stark contrast between Ortiz's public life and his hidden actions. It really makes you wonder, how can someone seem to function so well in society, holding down a responsible job, having a family, all while committing such horrific acts?
Yeah, that's what gets me. It's such a mind bender. We're talking about a guy who worked as an intelligence operator for Border Patrol for a whole decade. Like, there were no red flags, no disciplinary actions, nothing. Just a clean record. Married with 3 kids, a bachelor's degree from American Military University, and he even has a master's from St. Mary's University in Texas. On paper, this guy he seems like he has it all figured out, right? But then behind that facade, he's living this double life, preying on these vulnerable women.
Exactly, and it really highlights the limitations of profiling. There's no easy checklist or, a certain type of person who becomes a serial killer. It's not about fitting a stereotype. It's about understanding the complex interplay of individual psychology and all these external factors that can lead someone down such a dark path.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about the victims in this case. And, before we go any further, I just want to make it clear that we're approaching this with the utmost sensitivity and respect. These women were daughters, mothers, friends. Their lives were tragically cut short. They deserve to be remembered as individuals, not just, statistics in a case file.
Right. I agree with that. It's so important to acknowledge the human cost of these crimes. Each victim had a story, a network of loved ones, dreams, and aspirations that were taken from them.
Yeah, and it's just heartbreaking. So the victims were Giselda Alicia Hernandez Cantu, who was 35, Janelle Ortiz, age 28, 29-year-old Melissa Ramirez, and Claudine Ann Moera, who was 42. And it's just heartbreaking to know that Melissa was a mother of 2 and Claudine had 5 children. And their loss, it leaves a void that can never be filled.
Absolutely. In this case also, it brings up a broader issue. It underscores the vulnerability of marginalized groups, particularly sex workers. They're often targeted by predators like this because they operate in the shadows, and they face stigma and judgment that can prevent them from seeking help or reporting abuse.
It's a tragic reality, and you see it come up time and time again in serial killer cases. And all of Ortiz's crimes took place in September 2018. And the pattern was, well, it was chilling. He'd pick up these women, drive them to these isolated areas, and then shoot them. And what makes this even more disturbing is that he actually knew the first 2 victims personally.
Yeah, and that adds a whole other layer of complexity to this case. It suggests premeditation and, a disturbing sense of familiarity with his victims that goes beyond just targeting a specific profession.
Okay, so this is where things take a turn. And frankly, it's a story of incredible courage. There was one woman who actually managed to escape Ortiz's grasp. Her name was Erica Peta. And her story is really essential to understanding how this terrifying spree finally came to an end.
Right, Ericatina, her actions were heroic. She played a pivotal role in stopping Ortiz and likely saving other lives. In a situation where so many would freeze up or succumb to fear, she found the strength to fight back.
She was in Ortiz's vehicle when he threatened her with a gun. Can you imagine the terror of that moment? But somehow she managed to get away. She ran to a gas station where, by pure chance, a state trooper was refueling. You're running for your life shirtless because you had to leave everything behind, and you run into this potential lifeline.
Yeah, that chance encounter was a crucial turning point. But it also speaks volumes about Erica's quick thinking and her courage. She didn't hesitate to tell the officer everything she gave him: Ortiz's name, his vehicle description, everything she could remember. And that led to the police issuing a BOLO, a be-on-the-lookout alert for Ortiz, which was instrumental in his eventual capture.
It was an incredible stroke of luck, for sure. But let's not downplay Erica's role in all of this. She was in a fight-or-flight situation, and she chose to fight back. She took control in a moment of absolute terror, and that's ultimately what broke the case wide open.
I agree. It's such a powerful reminder that survival sometimes comes down to trusting your gut and taking action even when it seems impossible. Her actions had a ripple effect. She saved herself, but she also set in motion a chain of events that brought a dangerous predator to justice.
Once Erica escaped and the police were on his trail, Ortiz tried to dodge arrest by hiding out in a hotel parking garage. But here's where it gets even more unsettling. Before the cops closed in on him, he was posting these farewell messages on Facebook and stockpiling weapons.
Wow. And according to the sheriff's chief deputy, it seemed like Ortiz was setting the stage for what's known as suicide by cop, essentially trying to provoke the police into using deadly force. It's a tragic phenomenon where individuals, often in a state of despair or mental crisis, engage in behavior designed to get the police to shoot them. It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but it's important to recognize the signs and understand the underlying psychological factors involved.
It really does paint a bleak picture of someone who has lost all hope and is ready to go out in this blaze of self-destruction. But luckily, that's not how this ended. The police found him hiding in the bed of a truck at that hotel parking garage, and that's when he confessed, admitted to all 4 murders.
And during his confession, he admitted to a deep hatred for prostitutes.
Yeah, that really adds a whole other dimension to these crimes, doesn't it? It's not just random violence. It seems like he was specifically targeting these women because of who they were, the work they did.
Exactly. And it's a reminder of the constant stigma and danger that sex workers face. They're often marginalized and ostracized, which makes them easy targets for predators like Ortiz. And sadly, their murders often go unsolved or receive less attention than other homicides.
It's a sad truth. So after his arrest, Ortiz was hit with a bunch of charges: 4 counts of murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, unlawful restraint, and evading arrest. With a confession on record, it seemed like an open and shut case, right?
Well, you would think so, but despite admitting to the murders, Ortiz actually initially entered a plea of not guilty. It might seem counterintuitive, but it's actually a common legal strategy. It gives the defense attorneys a chance to explore all their options, try to find weaknesses in the prosecution's case, and maybe work out a plea deal. So it doesn't necessarily mean that he's denying what he did, but he's still, engaging in the legal process.
Interesting. So basically a way to keep all the doors open even when things seem pretty straightforward. So his trial started on November 28th, 2022. But get this, the district attorney decided not to seek the death penalty.
That's interesting. That decision probably came after a lot of consideration and weighing different factors. Death penalty cases are really complex, expensive, and time-consuming. They can drag on for years with appeals and legal challenges. So the DA probably considered those things along with the impact on the victims' families and decided that life in prison without parole was a better outcome.
Yeah, that makes sense. A life sentence guarantees he's off the streets for good, and it avoids the whole emotional roller coaster of a death penalty trial. So the trial went on, and on December 7th, 2022, the jury came back with their verdict: guilty on all 4 counts of murder. Ortiz was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, which effectively ended his reign of terror.
And that sentence gives some closure and justice for the families of the victims and the community. It ensured that he'll never be able to harm anyone else.
Absolutely. So let's take a closer look at the timeline of these horrific crimes. We know that all 4 victims were sex workers, and the murders all followed a similar pattern. But I think it's important to understand the individual stories the human faces behind the headlines. Let's go back to the beginning, the first victim.
So the first murder took place on September 3rd, 2018. The victim was Melissa Ramirez. She was 29 years old and a mother of 2. Ortiz admitted to picking her up and driving her to this deserted stretch of road in Webb County. It was just outside the city limits. He claimed that Melissa got out of the vehicle to go to the bathroom, and that's when he shot her multiple times.
It's just hard to even fathom the callousness of that act. He lures her to this secluded spot and then just like that her life is over.
Yeah, it speaks to a level of premeditation and a total lack of empathy. It's crucial to remember that behind these statistics are real people. People with families, friends, dreams. Melissa was someone's daughter, someone's mother. Her life had value, and it was brutally taken from her.
It's just awful. And then 10 days later, on September 13th, Ortiz picked up his second victim, Claudine Ann Luera. She was 42 years old and a mother of 5. And what makes this even more tragic is that Claudine knew Melissa Ramirez, the first victim. It's chilling to think about the fear she must have felt when she realized who she was with.
Yeah, according to Ortiz's confession, Claudine actually confronted him about Melissa's disappearance. Think about the courage it must have taken for her to do that, to demand answers from the very person who took her friend's life. And as she was getting out of his vehicle, he shot her in the head.
Wow, it's just heartbreaking. She was trying to find out what happened to her friend, trying to get justice for Melissa, and that act of bravery led to her own death.
Yeah, it's a tragedy. And Claudine's story really highlights the risks that sex workers face every day. They often work in dangerous and isolated places with little protection or support if something goes wrong. And the stigma surrounding their profession often prevents them from reporting violence or going to the authorities for help.
So both Melissa and Clardine's bodies were found in rural areas hidden from view. But the last two victims, Janelle Ortiz and Giselda Cantu, their bodies were found in a very different location along a 5-mile stretch of Highway 35.
Right, and unlike Melissa and Claudine Ortiz didn't know these women beforehand, he picked them up on separate occasions, each time driving them to a remote area along the highway and killing them in a similar way.
It almost feels like he was getting more brazen, more reckless with each murder, like the initial thrill was wearing off and he had to push things further to get the same level of satisfaction.
And that's a pattern you see sometimes in serial killer cases. As they continue to offend, they become more confident, less concerned about being caught. And their methods can become more and more brutal. It's a terrifying thought, but understanding these patterns is important for investigators. It helps them predict and hopefully prevent future crimes.
Yeah, thank goodness for Erica Pena. Her escape stopped his spree before he could hurt anyone else. It's scary to think about how many more lives might have been lost if she hadn't fought back.
You're absolutely right. Erica Pena's bravery shows how strong the human spirit can be, even in the face of unimaginable terror. Her actions were key in bringing Ortiz to justice and stopping more tragedy. It's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope and courage can win out.
Okay, so we've gone through the timeline, examined the victim stories, and discussed how Juan David Ortiz was caught. But now I want to go back to something we talked about earlier, the psychology behind his actions. What could make someone who, on the surface, seems to have a good life, a family, a career, to commit such horrible acts?
That's the question that's been puzzling criminologists and psychologists for ages. There's no easy answer, no one thing that explains what makes a serial killer. But we often see some common threads in these cases, a mix of individual traits and environmental factors.
Like what kind of factors? What contributes to someone becoming a serial killer? Is it nature, nurture, or a combination of both?
It's rarely that straightforward. We often see a complex interplay of psychological predispositions, things like antisocial personality disorder, lack of empathy, and a fascination with violence. And those things are coupled with environmental factors like childhood trauma, abuse, or neglect. It's like this perfect storm of vulnerability and darkness.
So it's not just one thing, but a whole web of influences that shape a person's path, for better or for worse. And in Ortiz's case, we see that complexity. His seemingly normal life compared to the brutality of his crimes. It's jarring.
It is.
We know he confessed to the murders, and he even said he hated prostitutes. But were there any other clues about his motives? Did he ever say why he targeted these women?
Well beyond his confession and that statement about hatred, publicly available information about his specific motives is limited. The trial was mainly focused on proving he was guilty, not on figuring out the details of his psychology.
But there has to be something more, right? Some deeper analysis from psychological evaluations or trial transcripts that sheds light on his hate, his thinking, his triggers.
You would think so, right? But sometimes, even with a conviction, even with a confession, we're left with more questions than answers. The human mind is a complicated thing, and some parts of it might stay hidden forever.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. We may never have the complete picture, which can be really frustrating, especially for those who want to understand what drives someone to do such horrible things. And in this case, that feeling of incompleteness is even stronger because Ortiz initially pleaded not guilty, even though he confessed. It adds another layer of mystery to an already complex and disturbing story.
I agree. It reminds us that the legal process, even though it's designed to find justice, doesn't always give us all the answers we're looking for. And sometimes the most unsettling truths remain hidden, locked away in the mind of the criminal.
It feels like we've uncovered so much in this deep dive, but this case really leaves you with a lot to think about. It's like we've peeled back the layers of a seemingly ordinary life and found this darkness underneath. It forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths about human nature and about the vulnerabilities that exist in our society.
It does. It's a sobering reminder that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, disguised by normalcy. This case challenges our assumptions about who is capable of doing these things, and it compels us to look beyond just appearances.
Yeah, the duality of Juan David Ortiz is what really gets me. He was a dedicated family man, a border patrol agent, someone who on paper seemed to be living a successful life, but at the same time, he was also a cold-blooded killer who preyed on vulnerable women. It's hard to reconcile those two sides.
It really is. And that's what makes these cases so fascinating and so disturbing. They shatter our illusion of control. They remind us that we can never truly know what's going on in the minds of other people, and that even those who seem to have it all together can have this hidden darkness.
We may never fully understand what led Ortiz to commit these horrific crimes, but I think it's important to try to understand. It helps us learn, it helps us maybe identify warning signs, and it pushes us to work to prevent similar tragedies from happening.
I agree with that. Every case like this gives us a chance to look at the cracks in our society, the places where vulnerability and predatory behavior intersect. We have a responsibility to learn from these tragedies, to fight for change, and to try to create a world where things like this are less likely to happen.
I like that. It's not just about bringing the people who commit these crimes to justice. It's about creating a world where these things happen less often. It's about having empathy, understanding, and a sense of responsibility for the safety of everyone in our communities.
Exactly. It requires a multi-pronged approach. Law enforcement, social services, advocacy groups all working together, and a shared commitment to building a fairer and more just society. It's a long and difficult road, but it's a journey we have to take if we truly want a world without violence and exploitation.
This deep dive into the Juan David Ortiz case has been tough, but it's a story that needs to be told. We owe it to the victims to remember their names, their stories, and the lives that were lost. We owe it to ourselves to face the realities of violence and exploitation. And we owe it to future generations to create a world that is safer and more just for everyone.
I couldn't have said it better myself. That's a powerful message to take with us. As we finish this deep dive, let's remember the human cost of these crimes. Let's honor the memory of the victims by continuing the conversation, by working towards solutions, and by fighting for a world where everyone feels safe, valued, and protected.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the dark world of Juan David Ortiz. We'll be back next time with another case that we hope will make you think, question, and engage in meaningful discussions. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.